First, I'd like to thank everyone for coming to yet another Zoom meeting. And there's so many of you, that's awesome. And thanks for not registering and then immediately forgetting, which is what I tend to do. I'd especially like to thank Melissa Barton and Michael Moran for including me in this lineup, and to the folks working behind the scenes in Beinecke who helped make this research possible. I'm really looking forward to sharing a bit about my favorite Harlem Renaissance figure, Georgia Doulgas Johnson. Georgia Blanche Douglas Camp Johnson works for a dream, for a legacy throughout her decades-long writing career. Though at one point she was a household name, Johnson is not reliably included in Harlem Renaissance or early African-American poetic scholarship. When she is included, the majority of attention is paid to her playwriting and hosting, but rarely does she step into the limelight as a full figure, a poet, a songwriter, a biographer, novelist, mother, friend, and lover. Anne Allen Shockley and Gloria T. Hull have published the fullest accounts of Johnson's life and writings, and these microbiographies are no small feat considering what happened to her work, which I'll touch on later. So far, here's what we know. Johnson was born on September 10th, 1880 in Atlanta, Georgia, though that date is contested because an 1880 census lists her as 5 years old at the time. Her parents, who were believed to be African-American, English, and Native American, raised her outside of Atlanta in Rome, Georgia, where she studied music and the violin. In fact, she attended 2 colleges for music, including Oberlin Conservatory and Cleveland College. She married Henry Lincoln Link Johnson Sr., a lawyer and notable member of the Republican Party, in 1903. She gave birth to 2 sons, Henry Lincoln Jr. and Peter Douglas. In 1910, after President Taft appointed Link as the recorder of deeds, the family moved to Washington, D.C., where Link expected Georgia Doulgas Johnson to focus more on her duties as a wife and mother instead of pursuing her creative dreams. When Link died of complications brought on by his 3rd stroke on Georgia's birthday in 1925, she was given a position in the Department of Labor so that she could continue to put her children through school. And one went to med school and one went to law school. So those were big bills. This job ate away at her writing time, and she was eventually let go from the position. But in the end, she was still able to publish 4 collections of poetry: Heart of a Woman, which came out in 1918, Bronze, which came out in 1922, and Autumn Love Cycle, my favorite, which came out in 1928, and Share My World in 1962. Jessie Redmond Fawcett, who shows up a lot in Beinecke in correspondence with the Harlem Renaissance figures, she helped put the first collection together with Georgia Doulgas Johnson. So shout out to her for believing in my girl. Johnson also published celebrated plays, including Blue Blood and Plumes. And those are only 2 of the many, many one-act plays that she put out. Not many of them made it to stage, and when they did, it was small local performances, so there's not that much of a record of them being performed, but she wrote them. She also wrote a popular lifestyle column, Homely Philosophies, for several years, and it was published in over 20 newspapers for that one column. She ran a letter club for singles called the Lonely Hearts Club. She published work under pseudonyms as well, including Nina Temple, Paul Tremaine, Nevaeh Gladstone, and Mary Strong. Alice Dunbar Nelson once wrote that, quote, Georgia Doulgas Johnson has as many aliases as Lon Chaney has faces, end quote. He's a silent movie actor. So she did change her name a lot. I think it kept things fun for her. In my personal opinion, An Autumn Love Cycle is one of the most provocative collections of poetry to come out of the Harlem Renaissance. At the time that book came out, she was a 48-year-old widow writing poetry on the subjects of celibacy, loneliness, intimacy, and passion. My favorite poem of hers, which you can see on the right side of the screen here, is Amour, and it's in this 3rd book. It's brief, but I think it speaks to the legacy she knew she was building. It reads, kiss me and let the hours bloom triumphantly before life's little sun has set and I am old. Love me. The day is fleet and I am far too passionate to die. How can you not love her? Embracing femininity, sexuality, not so much aging. She was pretty mad about aging, but an intensity of feeling. at a time when women in her position were meant to write about race relations and respectability. She applied to fellowship after fellowship to raise enough money to support herself and her family while still being a writer, almost all of which she lost, likely in part to WB Du Bois's cruel letters of recommendation. This is my favorite fun fact. It's probably blasphemous to call out Du Bois during Black History Month, but he was being a bad friend. So the story is, in one case, she asked him to write a letter of recommendation for the Guggenheim Foundation, and he agreed. And the note that he sent to Guggenheim read, quote, "She is erratic, illogical, and forgetful. She could never do a concentrated, sustained piece of work. Probably after a year's study in Paris or at home, she would have a very small body of accomplishment to show. But on the other hand, she is liable at any time to turn out some little thing of unusual value and beauty." That is about all I can say. Whether it would recommend her to your policy or not, I do not know. Signed. End quote. That's one of my favorite fun facts about their relationship. Her mid-century correspondence reveals a throbbing desperation for funding and publication, buried within a ceaseless optimism as she worked her network, looking for contacts and support all the way up to her death in 1966. She did not stop writing. She did not stop trying to get published. She loved her craft, so she kept it up. However, it is her weekly salon known as the Saturday Nighters Club that is remembered as her greatest contribution to African-American literary history. In the early 1920s, Gene Toomer, who's also a big, featured heavily in Beinecke, he forged a supportive literary community in DC by holding an informal study group of African-American people, but more specifically, mixed race middle-class writers. Though her identity as a mixed race woman was important to her, as evidenced by all of her poetry and her plays, and most likely her novel, which we'll get to, Johnson prided herself on having a home that served as a halfway house, not only sheltering the needy, but also functioning as a meeting point between many different kinds of people. Not long after the formation of Toomer's smaller group, Johnson took on the larger project of hosting writers across state lines, color lines, and class divides in her living room on Saturday nights. Elizabeth McHenry wrote, quote, "Held together by Johnson's dynamic personality and her clear vision of the importance of community to the creative artist, the Saturday Nighters was a society through which the most prominent literary and historical minds of the 1920s, as well as lesser luminaries of the decades past," end quote. Johnson's living room witnessed the formation and development of a literary movement as artists of all kinds traded ideas, critiqued work, and invented a new Negro aesthetic. Johnson was both tired and enlivened by her role as a host. Sure, the labor was taxing, but she loved being connected to the many brilliant minds that crossed her threshold. She saw herself as a mother to the younger ones and a student of the peers. Johnson's kind heart and charisma are remembered fondly. As Langston Hughes wrote in his autobiography, The Big C, quote, "I began to meet all the other young colored poets in Washington. Georgia Doulgas Johnson, a charming woman poet who had 2 sons in college, turned her house into a salon for us on Saturday nights. Marietta Bonner, Dutton Ferguson, Esther Popel, Richard Bruce Nugent, Mae Miller, Louis Alexander, John P. Davis, Willis Richardson, Hallie Queen, and Clarissa Scott used to come there to eat Mrs. Johnson's cake and drink her wine and talk poetry and books and plays. Sometimes Elaine Locke would drop in too," end quote. Now I really want to know what that cake recipe was because it got mentioned in The Big C. It was so good. Langston Hughes remembered it and put it in his autobiography. Her efforts to build a figurative room large enough for everyone speaks to her character. And yet, some scholars reduce her to a simple host. She published hundreds of poems, and her catalog of writings lists 10 prose books ready for publication, including One and One Makes Three and The Literary Salon, 31 short stories, roughly 30 plays, and 24 songs. Clearly, the legacy she was building was much larger than a salon, but unfortunately, much of that work is gone. My talk today is one step in my mission to reify Johnson's presence in the academic and public memory by sharing my quest to find her missing novel. Despite her many famous colleagues and friends, I am often met with furrowed brows of non-recognition when I mention her name. Discourse on absence in the archives pays close attention to the racism and sexism that may have precluded Georgia Doulgas Johnson and her work from scholarly memory, but her work also suffers the consequence of literal physical loss, with squatters burning a hole right through her famous living room floor after she died, according to a curator at Moreland Spingarn. And her papers were discarded as trash while family and friends attended her funeral, according to her contemporary and friend Owen Dodson, who witnessed the dumpsters himself. There's this article by Mbembe, The Power of the Archive and Its Limits, and it says that, quote, "The archive, therefore, is fundamentally a matter of discrimination and of selection, which, in the end, results in the granting of a privileged status to certain written documents and the refusal of that same status to others, thereby judged unarchivable. The archive is, therefore, not just a piece of data, but a status," end quote. And Jean-Christophe Pautier wrote in his book, Shadow Archives, quote, "So fraught with absences and removals and delayed restorations is the history of the Black literary archive that it could perhaps be described, after the poets Langston Hughes and Kevin Young, as a kind of montage of a dream deferred, forming a vast collective shadow book," end quote. Georgia Doulgas Johnson spent many more decades, attempting to get that same novel published. Eventually, her audience would move on and new audiences would find her appeals for interracial harmony outdated, especially amidst the radicalism of work like Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man and Gwendolyn Brooks' Maud Martha coming out in that mid-century moment. Johnson's work may well have been decomposed or repurposed or turned to ashes. What then of her dream? Aside from the dual-winded sword of racism and sexism that may have kept Johnson's work out of the archives, even if it did survive, intraracial misogyny devalued Johnson's pen. Her contemporaries, including her peers and her friends, reduced her poetry to simple woman talk. The introductions to her first two books, written by William Stanley Braithwaite and WB Du Bois, respectively, referred to her writing as, quote, "intensely feminine," end quote, and, quote, "sometimes trite," end quote. Johnson embraced her femininity, even after receiving criticism for her lack of racial consciousness, which prompted her to write and publish Bronze, her second book. Johnson tells the story of Blackness in America from a distinctly feminine perspective. And after Bronze, she returned to the prioritization of her gender and tenderness and softness in her work in An Autumn Love Cycle. Her lifestyle column primarily advised other women, and though she may have accepted the intensely feminine label, the men in her life made their positions clear. Undermining her in her own forewords, Du Bois and Braithwaite joined Johnson's husband and other critics in discrediting the value of her writing. Because those closest to her did not value her work, the chances of its survival after death were slim. Though I do not want to reduce my quest to find her missing novel to a simple recovery project, this search was driven by pangs of curiosity sparked by Johnson's sizable, sometimes invisible presence that indicated an even larger absence. In other words, as Pautier suggests, quote, "anything saved serves only to remind us of all that was lost," end quote. I spent nearly 7 months searching for 1 or 2 books, White Men's Children and or 1 and 1 Makes 3. The latter title makes an appearance toward the end of her life, but both titles likely refer to the same piece of writing. This is the story of a hyper-present absence that led me to walk through Johnson's literary network towards several closed doors. This is the story of how I got lost in Georgia. Back to the starting point, and that is a callback to this play, The Starting Point, that is featured in Melissa Barton's latest exhibit, BRAVA, Women Make American Theater. She has this self-record that she wrote of her own plays and her poetry, and that novel down there at the bottom. In the summer of 2019, I received a pre-prospective summer fellowship from the Beinecke to do research on Georgia Doulgas Johnson, a name I was familiar with, but a figure about whom I knew very little. Johnson's papers are primarily at Moreland Spingarn and Howard, but due to her connections to very prominent people in the Harlem Renaissance, Johnson's name came up quite a few times in the James Weldon Johnson collection here. I pulled folders from the James Weldon Johnson and Grace Nail Johnson papers, William Stanley Braithwaite papers, Carl Van Vechten papers, Walter Francis White and Poppy Cannon papers, Zora Neale Hurston collection, Jean Toomer papers, Langston Hughes papers, and Bruce Nugent papers. My notes from this time are scattered. I wrote down little facts about what she was reading, where she was working, and with whom she frequently corresponded. My first note mentioning the novel comes from her letters to Harold Jackman. In 1937, she mentions finishing a novel. She repeats that she has a novel to Jackman again in 1942 and has two other undated letters to him that discuss trying to finish and editing in order to start soliciting publishers. Letters to Bruce Nugent in 1947 and 1951 reiterate her working on and trying to place the novel. And in 1951, that title is listed as White Men's Children. The front page of her manuscript for the play, The Starting Point, which you can see here, which is undated. It lists that the novel is titled White Men's Children. It's about, quote, the new race, end quote. And she says that it is, quote, with publisher. Which publisher? I have no idea. I checked with the publishers of her previous books from that point, but I couldn't find anything. Her obituary states that, quote, Mrs. Johnson wrote a score of songs, many short stories and plays, and a novel, comma, 1 and 1 makes 3, end quote. A letter to Dr. Troop, written October 10th, 1961, also uses the title 1 and 1 makes 3. So right now we have a record from 1937 to 1961 of Georgia Doulgas Johnson working on and trying to promote the same piece of writing unsuccessfully. This change in titles, the ambiguous publisher, and the decades between the first and last mentions of the novel, the traces of its existence in Beinecke, provided more questions than answers. I had to expand the boundaries of my search, so I began to ask who and where instead of simply what. I wanted so bad just to know what it was about, but I was gonna have to figure out who all her friends were, who all her publishers were, everyone in her network that could possibly have received a chapter in the mail. It was a whole thing. The list of people involved in Georgia Doulgas Johnson's literary career is far too long to list here. Indeed, the list was too long for me to search each name thoroughly, find all of these people's papers, beg librarians to give me more information than what was available on the finding aid, and hopefully stumble upon a chapter or two of White Men's Children or 1 and 1 makes 3. As I compiled friends, editors, publishers, and anyone else to whom Johnson mailed chapters, I attempted to rank them based on the likelihood that they themselves were deemed culturally valuable enough to have a collection of papers, and the likelihood that they found Johnson's work valuable enough to keep. Between her letters in Beinecke and Moreland Spingarn, Johnson writes about sending chapters to Benjamin Griffith Brawley, Dahl or Saul from Boston University, unnamed publishers and agents. The publishers of her poetry include the Cornhill Company, B.J. Bremer Company, H. Vinyl Limited. Both Cornhill and Bremer were under the control of William Stanley Braithwaite at some point, but none of Braithwaite's papers that I've searched contain chapters of her novels, and both companies went out of business. The people she trusted most with her work were Bruce Nugent, Harold Jackman, and Du Bois. Du Bois's papers, that's going to take me a long time to comb through, but the little that I've gotten through, haven't seen them in there. All I've seen was evidence of an affair between the two, and it's more of their business than I needed. I found a few letters, made connections between people and publishers, and came across a few good books. But from what I could see and from what librarians in New York, DC, Connecticut, and Georgia could communicate through email, White Men's Children and 1 and 1 makes 3 are gone. They are archival ghosts, lingering in the letters without a tangible body to be found. The most important document I got to hold was Johnson's self-written catalog of works. She documented herself, illustrating treasures that she truly believed the world would one day accept and admire. Though those in her life seemed to treat her with a superficial or cold love, Johnson's belief in herself and her writing never wavered. Her love of self ran so deeply that she interacted with her own pseudonyms, which is another great example of why I love this lady. So she's writing into a newspaper for this womanly column under the name Mary Strong. She sends a letter to the editor of that paper saying, have you read the work of Georgia Doulgas Johnson? It's really good. I think you should publish it. And she also prints herself a congratulatory ad for winning some prize under one of her pseudonyms' name. She's wild and she's fun. I think it kept things fun. I still believe that someone somewhere would have found her writing important enough to save, even if it is in a personal collection being unknowingly passed down within a family. I've not yet been able to track down any of Johnson's relatives or descendants. She outlived her youngest son. I haven't been able to find out if they've had children. The census doesn't say anything about them having descendants. But Georgia Doulgas Johnson never ran out of hope, despite the many doors that closed in her face. The least I could do is keep looking. Attempting to fill in the gap with speculation, I imagine that White Men's Children is an exploration of the racial divide or the color line from the perspective of someone who imagined herself straddling both sides of it. Her poem, The Riddle, published in Elaine Locke's 1925 anthology, The New Negro in Interpretation, reads as follows. White men's children spread over the earth, a rainbow suspending the drawn swords of birth, uniting and blending their races in one, the world man, cosmopolite, every man's son. He channels the streams of red blood and blue. Behold him, a Triton, the peer of the two. Unriddle this riddle of outside in, white men's children and black men's skin. That last line, don't you want to read that book? I want to read that book. Johnson's poem reaffirms her belief that the solution to the color problem is interracial children, the new race. Placed in context, the riddle is a riddle in its own right. Surely race relations would need more than interracial children to resolve itself. This poem and Johnson's entry for 1 and 1 Makes 3 in her self-catalog tell a curious story. At the catalog, she writes that this novel is the story of a child born of a father with years of intellectual culture in his background, and a mother with a perfect body, a big soul, and a warm heart, producing a child who sums the two parents and adds comprehension, understanding, tolerance, vigor, energy, beauty, and love, such being the resultant of a perfect summation of new world beginning, end quote. Between these few sources, I suspect that this novel is a utopian fiction in which the child is a bridge between two different worlds. The descriptions of the parents raise questions like, what is intellectual culture and what does the mother's perfect body have to do with the plot? In this new world, do Black people and white people no longer exist? Is the answer to intolerance eradicating difference? Based on its description, this novel would not fit in very well into a Black radical tradition. It would not draw attention to the African Americans' plight the way race men and women were expected to do. Instead of uplifting the race, it threatened to erase it. Though such a novel may have attracted interest closer to the turn of the century with elite race men, by the 1940s, such a work would be obsolete. Even today, I could imagine such a novel garnering either disinterest or passionate social backlash on Twitter. When I first started my search, based on the title, I was hoping to find a sharp critique of the violence of white men's sexuality enacted on the African American community and how patriarchal white supremacy was inherited over generations. Johnson, however, had a very different idea of the social consequences of white men's procreation. Still, the fact that even the mention of a title sparked such a vivid story in my mind speaks to the power of the archives and the impact of its absences. Had I found the manuscript immediately, I doubt that I would have prodded as deeply into Johnson's life, network, publication history, and book history. The absence prompted questions for me that I had not initially thought to ask. The sleuthing brought us closer. The practice of speculation is central to African American studies, a method necessitated by and necessitating deficiency and non-existence. Even if I never retrieve the novel, I can still bring her back into public consciousness through discourse about her loss. So, is Georgia Doulgas Johnson's novel lost or just missing? And who is to blame either way? No matter how diligently scholars pursue the questions raised by gaps in the collections, there will always be objects lost to time, undervaluation, discrimination, and a horde of other obstacles that keep African American subjects, especially free ones, off the record. Invention and speculation have proven to be academically fruitful in many ways. The fact that this discipline persists despite the dearth of recoverable material speaks to a dedication to the project of African American studies and to the power of imagination in the academy. In keeping with this tradition, I am forced to release my fixation on knowing Georgia Doulgas Johnson and the breadth of her work completely, and let it taper into a more patient pursuit. I will likely never read White Men's Children, and even if I do, it's never going to be the story that I thought that it was. This is not to say that nothing is found. Oh, actually, I must skip that. Even more likely, the book that I want has yet to be written. The character of Georgia Doulgas Johnson that I have come to know through her incomplete archive intrigues me enough to want to know more, though we often disagree on matters of social inequities and comportment. Looking for Georgia has been a practice in an archival patience and flexibility. I have encountered closed doors and in silences and collections before, but never one that enticed me to look for more in the way that Georgia's has. Her lost work may never resurface, but her spirit lives on in the things that have survived and in our yearning to know what did not. I'll end with a passage from my favorite letter that she wrote to Harold Jackman on September 29th, 1939. It says, quote, "I am hoping all things, great things, but don't be surprised. I am always hoping with my heart's bright eyes. Sometimes I am ashamed to tell my friends how optimistic I am in spite of everything, but I am. Just feel that all the bright and beautiful things are just around the corner," end quote. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kassidi. That was an extraordinary 25 minutes of the power of imagination. So as we have in the chat, all caps already, brava, brava, brava. Couple questions, and encourage people in the audience to post your questions in the Q&A. We'll get to as many as possible. My hunch is, like me, your presentation today has incited a lot of interest in Georgia Doulgas Johnson. And my bet is people on screen have been Googling and searching and will be. As someone who's been at this for a while, if I wanted to start with one of her texts, one or two, where would you suggest among her rather prodigious output that I might begin?
Oh boy. I think one of the short plays is a great place to start. I feel like that's what people expected of her in her poetry. A lot of that racial consciousness shows up in her dramatic writing more than her poetic writing. And they're just really interesting. And there are a lot of twists for little one-act plays. And then I would go to An Autumn Love Cycle, just because the heat in that book to come out in the 1920s, I think it's a marvel. I love it.
Terrific. And you talked a little bit about that you knew of Georgia Doulgas Johnson before you really began diving in this pre-prospective work. But what was it? What do you remember when you first, and sort of what you thought on first encountering Georgia Doulgas Johnson?
I do. I was taking a class on modernism here at Yale with Ben Glaser, and one of her poems, which was previously titled Black Women, which got changed to Motherhood, which is about trepidation about birthing a Black child in this context, in the context in which she was living, that I thought was really spicy. Again, just not what I expected from someone whose other writing is such this poetess figure, writing these perfect quatrains about nature and about love, and also this really terrifying poem about not wanting to give birth. She contains so many multitudes. So that was the day.
As you were closing, I'm sure I'm one of the many who hope and trust that the book on Georgia Doulgas Johnson will be written by Kassidi Jones. And as you've been talking, it seems to me that I also trust and hope that Netflix or others will option it, because the way you bring to life just in the time how cinematic her life was and how much she merits cinematic treatment. So we will pray that your book will come out and that it'll be optioned. Let me quote a question from Melissa Barton. And there's a number of other questions in the audience, and I'll just quote this in full and you can respond. So Melissa asks, I wonder if you could talk more about Georgia Doulgas Johnson and gender. Several moments struck me in your talk. Du Bois's recommendation seemed very gendered, of course, the mother with a great body. And then the thinking of her as, quote, merely a host where I wonder if our admiration for her ability to bring people together is diminished by it being considered a woman's talent. So
Absolutely. Absolutely. Even the mentions, there's a lot of exciting mentions of her hosting these events. But like Langston Hughes wrote, she's remembered for her great cakes and her drinks, and not the fact that she created this enduring scholarly literary environment that connected people that may not have gotten connected before. She got Jean Toomer published in an anthology before Jean Toomer was getting published regularly. Before Kane came out. That's a great question. Her legacy is very gendered. I think it's difficult for me to talk about how that gendering was devalued because of how much she valued her own gender and her own work. She loved her womanhood and femininity. Even though the men around her would use it to belittle her, in her own preface to her own poetry, she didn't let that stop her from doing the work. Her husband, who wanted her to get in the kitchen and keep birthing babies, the year that he died, she started the salon. So she just kind of got him out of the way and continued to do the kind of work that she wanted to do. And I love her for it. Her womanhood is something to honor. So when we talk about her, we should talk about gender, but we should talk about it in a way that honors it in the way that she would honor it.
Terrific. A question about cultural production and circulation. How important were such publications as Crisis and Opportunity to Johnson's literary career? Could she have published portions of the novel in these literary magazines?
I have looked for chapter sections in literary magazines. They're very important. They're crucial. She didn't start publishing poetry until maybe her 30s, and it started in Black periodicals like The Crisis and The Opportunity. I haven't seen her write prose in those sorts of venues in that kind of medium. She's written the newspaper articles, of course, that are telling women how to smell nicer to attract men and stuff like that, but not so much her serious prose. And she wrote short stories, and those got published in some later anthologies as well. But I haven't been able to find pieces of those chapters yet.
The question you talked about a number of her literary and cultural relationships. Someone asked, raised the names of Jessie Fawcett and Nella Larson. So I wonder if either or both of those, you might expand some on her intersections and interactions with Fawcett and or Larson.
Yep. So Jessie Fawcett definitely helped her put together Heart of a Woman, her first collection. They organized that together. Nella Larson was definitely invited to the house, and I think they would be good friends because I feel like Georgia Doulgas Johnson would have a lot to say about Passing in Quicksand, considering how concerned she was with this interracial future. But those are the only ways I know that they come up.
A question from one of our upcoming speakers from 2 weeks from now, Catherine Sheehy. So Catherine asks, what did Georgia Doulgas Johnson think her relationship with WB Du Bois was? What documents exist outside his dubious letter of recommendation? So what do we know from her side of the relationship?
They have exchanged very personal letters, some of which are online. A lot of letters to and from Du Bois have been digitized so far. So if you go to any of those digital libraries and look for her name, you'll find sometimes hundreds of letters of correspondence between them, with his talking about how he's going to come visit her after midnight and to wear her finest stockings because he shall kiss her. So I think she thought that it was going somewhere that it did not end up going, because she did not become the second Mrs. Du Bois. And that terrible letter of recommendation came out shortly after their affair seems to have ended, according to the letters. So perhaps he was just bitter.
Audience member asks a question about her work around lynching and anti-lynching.
Yeah, that's the subject of a lot of the plays. Doing a lot of anti-lynching advocacy. Her plays have won awards, so I know that there were eyes on them, but I still cannot find a lot of evidence of their being performed, just kind of read and critiqued. But she was very passionately involved. Thank you for the link, Melissa. That's exactly what I was referring to. She was very involved in this writer activist field, trying to draw attention to the injustices of lynching.
I wonder if you could, you've given some sense of your own practice. We have a mixed audience, as it were, people who are hardcore archival scholars, people who've never really worked in an archive. And I wonder, as somebody who's become a super hardcore archival scholar, when you first started, things that you learned that you would share and encourage people who are just getting started and working in archives, any tips of the trade that you might have to offer?
Oh, make friends with the people behind the desk. I know that you may think you're being nice to them, but be even nicer than you already are, because they hold all of the keys to all of the juicy treasures that are in any given archive. Be sweet to them. Thank them so much when they tell you about that random one-off title on some shelf you never thought to look on that turns your research around. Praise them in your acknowledgements, because they are the backbone of everything that we do. That's my advice.
Amen.
Take Ingrid to lunch. That's my advice.
Audience member asked a question, I'll quote directly. She had the support of gay figures like Bruce Nugent and Harold Jackman. Was this significant to you?
Yes, this is a really good question, because she talks so much about her sensuality and sexuality in her writing. I think that having conversations with people that are openly queer would have helped her open those doors even more, push her even more to be honest with herself about what it's like to be pushing 50, single, and wanting some company because Du Bois can't come because he's in Europe.
A question, and I'll quote it directly. It sounded like Georgia Doulgas Johnson was far ahead of her time in terms of being close to a feminist via her literary works grounded in feminism. Would it be accurate to say Ms. Johnson was an early activist in feminism and also possibly gender politics in terms of how she used her literary voice in speaking upon the intersectionalities of race and gender?
Ooh, that's a big question. I don't think she would call herself a feminist if she were alive today. I think she was really proud of womanhood. Maybe she would have aligned with womanism a bit more, but feminism, I don't think, well, maybe she would, given her big interracial future ideas. She would think that one day, one of these waves of feminism was going to care about her Blackness, and she would have hung on and repped the title. But I think that her concern with and promotion of femininity, her embracing of her femininity and womanhood, was not exactly in line with what the strict feminists would have wanted. Like, I'm not sure they would have wanted her to publish a poem about celibacy. But she thought it was important that she did think it was important that women were allowed to do what they want, and that men should get out of their way so that they could do what they want. But, yeah.
Another question to sort of invite generalists in. Many people, in seeing the notice of this and looking at your page online, there are probably people in the audience who could discourse at length about ecopoetics, and there are probably people who are seeing the term for the first time. For those who are encountering ecopoetics, could you give us an entree into it?
Yeah, so at its core, ecopoetics is about poetry that has to do with nature, responding to nature, writing with nature. My dissertation is on 19th century African-American ecopoetics. So I'm looking at the ways that African-Americans featured natural elements like water and soil to articulate a kind of freedom that wasn't possible for them at the time on land. So thinking about the ways that the ocean is a vessel to literal freedom, but also a figurative freedom in a religious sense, there's a lot of that. Trees talking to trees, loving trees. Everyone remembers Paul Laurence Dunbar's The Haunted Oak. That's a famous tree poem about how trees evoke these terrible memories in African Americans. But my dissertation is more about another tree poem he had called The Old Apple Tree, which is about falling in love and reading and feeling at peace under a tree. I'm trying to override a narrative that says that Black folks and nature don't mix, because we've been mixing for centuries.
You've done both, you're giving this talk in conjunction and have talked much with Melissa about the show. You worked with her, I think, in the Harlem Renaissance. I wonder if you could give some insight into curatorial practice and what you've learned. You've been a scholar, as it were, in the courtyard level here with the archives, but you've also been part of the process of bringing these works to light in exhibitions to the public in the exhibition hall, and wonder what you've seen and learned in that process.
Oh, I've learned that it's so difficult to figure out how to represent an entire moment, an entire era, a literary movement with just a few objects, because you can't show everything. There are these spatial limitations, and also less is sometimes more when trying to tell a story like this. But the intention behind each piece that gets displayed and what's written about it, and the dots that a curator is trying to get you to connect as you walk through an exhibit. I had never thought so deeply about the process that goes behind telling a story in that way.
Great. Thank you for that. We have a question about her relationship with younger Black women poets, and two names mentioned are Gwendolyn Bennett and Lillian Johnson. I wonder if you could, if you know about either or both relationships, as well as in general her over the years and her relationship with younger generations.
I believe she did have a relationship with Lillian Johnson, because their work was showing up in similar spaces, similar anthologies, usually right next to each other because of the last names. And I believe I read some correspondence between the two, but I'm not entirely sure. Georgia Doulgas Johnson did love to feel like a mentor. So she did have relationships with younger Black women writers, trying to encourage them, frequently trying to connect them to people who are publishing. So when she knows that her friend has an anthology coming out, she's saying, okay, I'm going to give you this person's number. She's not even going to ask. She said, I'm sending you a packet from my friend, this young woman. There's someone named Bessie Winston something. I can't remember the last name in particular, but she was really encouraging, I think, of younger women in the movement.
Audience member notes that there's Zora Neale Hurston plays that have been unearthed that had been sent to the Library of Congress for copyright purposes and not published, and wondered if Johnson might have taken that avenue, and in the jumble of manuscripts there might be a copy of the novel. So have you intersected with the Library of Congress?
I haven't looked there. We're going to have to save this chat and email it to me, and then I will make sure all 111 of us are in the acknowledgements when I find it. Thank you for that tip.
Yeah, these things are great for those kinds of reasons. You're a wonderful teaching fellow at Yale, and if and when students in Yale College come to you and say, I want to go do something in the archives here, where would you point them? What's the sort of on your list of things that you've come across that if you had the time you might pursue, but you would encourage other young scholars to make use of here on campus?
Ooh, that's also a really good question. Whenever anyone tells me that they want to get started in the archives at Beinecke, I tell them they have to try to get permission to get the signed copy of Phyllis Wheatley's first book, Phyllis Wheatley's collection, out of the vault. It's vaulted. You have to ask somebody to see it. But that was a really powerful moment for me in the archives, holding something that I know she had held. Oh, whew, I got emotional right there in the reading room. But as far as interesting, I think there are some zines coming through, smaller publications, or maybe one-off publications that never turned into a series that could make for a really interesting article that I don't have time to write, but somebody should. I know we have fire. I don't think that enough folks have written enough about fire with 3 exclamation points, which is this one-off publication in there. That's where I'd say to look. The periodicals, I'm a big proponent of periodicals. I think people need to get into there.
I put in the chat registration for tomorrow's symposium, one of a number of events, such as this Monday's at Beinecke Talk, organized by Melissa Barton in conjunction with the show. Tomorrow's panel discussion at 1 p.m. is on women, theater, and archives, research and teaching. Encourage everyone who can to participate in that. And I also am putting in a link to the chat for the next Mondays at Beinecke, which is going to be on February 14th at 4 o'clock, of course. And this will feature love letters and Valentines from the collections, a number of selections read by Beinecke Library staff and friends. So hope you all will join us for that. Kassidi helped set the stage for next Mondays at Beinecke Love Letters with the wonderful Amour poem by Georgia Doulgas Johnson. So thank you for that. And wanted to give the final word to you, Kassidi, and as I'll offer a prompt, but you should say whatever you want as the closing word and benediction. Before I do, we really do have a robust and well-deserved set of kudos and congrats and gratitude and thank yous to you. Lots of exclamation points, lots of thank yous. And I think mission accomplished of raising Georgia Doulgas Johnson up to a
Read Georgia, yes.
Next set of people who will, I think, then help radiate out further. And I get the prompt question is in 2022, in thinking about the past and the present for the future, how do you think, and how does Georgia Doulgas Johnson speak to this world in this time from her time, and as we try and make sense of things going forward?
Her unbridled optimism. I could only hope to replicate it. I definitely don't have it in me, but like she said, all the bright and beautiful things are around the corner. So if we keep holding on, we're going to get there. This has been a really difficult couple of years for a lot of reasons. But I know that she would want us to keep looking forward because our day is going to come.
Well, I can't think of a better way to start a week, be at the start of a month, than bright and beautiful things like that. And you have certainly brought and given us a bright and beautiful talk. Thank you so much, Kassidi. Thank you. And thank you for this talk. Thanks everybody for coming, and see you all soon.